is because New York is one of the several habitations of the indigenous Negroes who are producing much folly in our awakening, either it be in the Black Conscious Movement, in the Hebrew Israelite awakening, and very many other religions and falsehoods that our people are following, such as the Nation of Islam. Christianity is Creflo Dollar and T.D. Jakes. These are Negro Indians who are among us, which I'm about to show and prove.
Shalom, my name is Sabal Al-Alam, representing for the House of Israel over here at the...
Now you see that folly? From the beginning.
Shalom, my name is Sabal Al-Alam, representing for the House of Israel over here
That's folly. Anybody that knows what that is should clearly know that these men are not doing righteousness. And this is why. This is why these men right here are doing what they're doing. It's because they come from the tribe of Dan, which we're going to prove. Virginia passed 2 acts in 1682 that combined Native Americans and Africans into one category as Negroes. This was the beginning of the integration of 2 different tribes in Israel. This is a biblical prophecy that you will not hear in your Israelite acronym camps, alphabet camps today. This is a prophecy. These are two different kinds of Israelites, 2 different nations of people. A Negro, indigenous Negro, who is called the Native American in the Act, in the Virginia Act, was called a Native American. But we know that not all so-called Native Americans or indigenous are calling themselves Negroes. So this is only talking about certain black indigenous people to be able to be called Negroes, because the Indians sitting on certain reservations today are not calling themselves Negro. But we have Native Americans who are indigenous to America, who were here before Columbus, who have been integrated with the Negro who was brought here from the slave trade. Now, if you understand the basics of the Bible, you understand that there was a split in Israel, and that the northern kingdom came to the Americas first. The northern tribes were 10. Out of the 10 tribes, or so-called lost tribes of Israel, sits the tribe of Dan, who came over here to do righteousness from the beginning, who was at that time still, after the time of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, was still integrated with us. They were still part of Israel at that time. They didn't become a blotted out tribe until after the Messiah came. But this Negro Indian slave trade Negro integration is a biblical prophecy, the lion's whelp prophecy, in which here in Deuteronomy 33, and verse 22, when it speaks of Dan, here in Deuteronomy 33:22, it says, "And of Dan, he said, Dan is a lion's whelp." Okay, we're going to go to Genesis now, 49, and verse number 9. It says, Judah is a lion's whelp. Did you see that? Genesis 49 and 9. Judah is a lion's whelp, a southern kingdom. Deuteronomy 33:22, and of Dan, he said, Dan is a lion's whelp, a northern kingdom. Okay. Here you have a northern kingdom Negro, a southern kingdom Israelite, integrated. This is the lion's whelp prophecy, which I'll go into deeper as to exactly what that means biblically and historically. It goes so deep as to where I'll break down the fact that these Negro Indian right here, which is a Danite, this is what the tribe of Dan is and looks like. He's an indigenous Negro who's been integrated with the slave trade Negro. People such as MLK come from the indigenous Negroes. You would never even know that from history. The history books aren't telling you this. Your Israelite sects aren't telling you that even Martin Luther King Jr., who has been one of the most contrary Negroes to the best interests of the slave trade Negro, subtly comes from. He doesn't even come from the slave trade. You would never learn that in your public educational systems, that Martin Luther King Jr. never even descended from the slave trade. But we're going to go and prove this, which is very simple. And a lot of it goes into this right here, this Negro Indian and slave trade, Negro integration. Okay, so I want to pull up this speech, the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech. I made a statement on social media where I said Martin Luther King Jr. is the face of the Lion's Whelp prophecy, and no one understood it because they don't even know who the basics about the tribe of Dan. We're going to go into this real quick. It's just a couple lines from the I Have a Dream speech from Martin Luther King Jr.
100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later.
Okay, so he says 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. That is a cry. That is an impoverished cry. Crying out for a Negro people who we have already made known that is two different nations calling themselves Negro, a Negro Indian and a Negro slave trade Negro calling themselves Negroes, two different people. So he's speaking on a general category as Negro. And he says 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty. That is a lion's whelp cry. That is a cry for, the lion's whelp goes into a lion's cub crying for hunger. Their cry here in America for hunger, our impoverished cry here in America. I'll get into the precepts here in a minute. 100 years later.
The Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land.
That's the key. 100 years later, the Negro still finds himself in poverty. Well, let me go over this. Still languished in the corners of American society.
The Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land.
And finds himself in exile in his own land. So the Negro that is in exile in his own land is who he's speaking on behalf of, being impoverished. Now, as I just showed you, the Negro Indians and the slave trade Negro, if you're a Negro exiled in your own land, it is impossible for you to have been brought here on slave ships. If you're impoverished, a Negro in exile on your own land, that would mean that you were indigenous to America. Because we here from the slave trade know that we're in a foreign land. This is not our land. Our land was taken from us from the beginning in Israel, but then afterwards, when we settled in the western coast of Africa, that is also in itself. So we know for a fact that we're not in our own land. We're a stranger in a foreign land. So if you're in exile in your own land, that would make you indigenous to America and completely different than the slave trade Negro. We'll do that one more time.
In exile in his own land.
In exile.
And finds himself in exile in his own land.
And finds himself in exile in his own land. That right there, those key words, in exile in his own land. That right there alone proves that this man was not brought here on slave ships. And if this was your land, that means that you was already here. Just like this Negro Indian right here. He wouldn't be a prisoner of war who was brought here in exile in a foreign land, but in exile in his own land. And integrated as being called a Negro. You'll never learn that. You'll never hear that in any one of these Israelite camps today, because these Israelite camps and these Israelite sects are headed by this Negro Indian here. misleading the slave trade Negro and the Hispanics and other Native American Indians as much as possible. This goes very much deep. This is just skimming the top, the surface, like getting a few basics out of the way. But this right here goes excessively deep into very many different areas, like different black masonry groups, like the Black Boule. It goes into different Christian religions and different Creflo Dollars and T.D. Jakes, Louis Farrakhan, Nation of Islam. These are Negro Indians. They're Hebrew. They're Israelites. They're Jacob. It goes so deep to where they were Jews, but they're not of the elect of Israel. They were Hebrews. They were Israel. But this is a blotted out tribe in which we'll go into all of the dark sayings and deep speech on this page and on this YouTube channel. I'm going to try to touch as much of the dark sayings and deep parables that pertain to this nation of people. And I am showing proof that this folly here and this folly here and all of the folly that these brothers are bringing to the table was foretold to happen. And many of our people are going to fall for these things, which I'll also go into some of the precepts. I just want to touch on some of the basics of the tribe of Dan and the manipulation. And I wanted to just bring out from the snake's mouth himself claiming to be of Samson's lineage, because that goes excessively deep. That right there speaks in volumes to a man who has just a little bit of understanding of what's going on, a little bit of understanding of the precepts. If you believe that you can understand this real truth without knowing who the serpent by the way and the adder and the path is, you've been deceived. Because this is definitely required knowledge. If not, we're gonna prove that it is. Right here in Genesis 49:17, it says, Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path that biteth the horse heel, so that his rider shall fall backward. Verse number 18, I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord. Most High, I have waited for thy salvation. Now you ask an Israelite camp or sect what that means, why I have waited for thy salvation is mentioned after the tribe of Dan, the serpent by the way and the adder in the path, who is blotted out of the book of the living according to Revelation 7. Why would salvation be mentioned after the tribe of Dan? What is that about? This goes into deep sayings and dark speech. This is definite proof that salvation depends much on the knowledge of our people's knowledge of, not just all of these not all of these tribes, but definitely understanding who the tribe of Dan is. Because if you're calling Danites or the indigenous Negroes Judah, then you're not teaching the truth. You're saying something false. That's a lie. No lie is of the truth. But I'm gonna go deeper into this in other videos, exactly as to why these Negroes have been blotted out of the book of the living. All praises to the Most High if you watch this, and even more praises to the Son of the Most High if you've been unblinded from these things, because very many people are blinded from the fact that we have a serpent by the way among us. So all praises to the Most High and His Son if you're watching this.